My dog saved my life on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. When Max started growling at my bride during our wedding ceremony, I thought he was just being protective. But what I discovered 3 days later completely shattered everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd just married. This story will make you question whether animals really can sense things we can't. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why I now trust my dog's judgment more than my own heart. I'm Jake, and 6 months ago I thought I had it all figured out. Beautiful fiancée named Sarah, dream wedding plan down to every detail, and Max, my loyal German Shepherd who'd been with me for 8 years through thick and thin. Max had always been the perfect judge of character. He loved everyone I brought home. My friends, my family, even my ex-girlfriends got the Max seal of approval. Everyone except Sarah. And I was about to find out why in the most devastating way possible. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. The signs were there from the very beginning. I just chose to ignore them because I was so blinded by what I thought was love. Stay with me because this gets much darker than you might expect. And there's a twist near the end that even I didn't see coming until it was almost too late. Let me take you back to where it all started, because understanding how Max reacted from day one is crucial to this story. The first time Sarah met Max was on our 3rd date, about 4 months into our relationship. I'd been talking about Max constantly, how he was my best friend, my hiking buddy, basically my family. Sarah seemed charmed by how much I loved my dog, always asking to see pictures and hear stories about our adventures. I was so excited to introduce them. I'd brought her back to my apartment after dinner, practically bouncing with anticipation. "You're going to love him," I kept saying. "And he's going to love you." I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment Sarah walked through my front door, Max's entire demeanor changed in a way I'd never witnessed before. His ears went back flat against his head, his hackles raised like he'd seen a threat, and he let out this low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. It wasn't his normal stranger at the door alert bark. This was something primal, something that made the hair on my own arms stand up. Sarah's reaction was interesting, looking back on it now. She didn't seem surprised or hurt. Instead, she laughed it off with this casual wave of her hand. "Oh, I'm not really a dog person anyway," she said with a smile that I thought was understanding and patient. "He'll warm up to me eventually. They always do." That phrase, "they always do," should have been my first major red flag. It implied she'd dealt with hostile animals before, which seemed odd for someone who claimed not to be a dog person. Over the next few months, as our relationship got more serious, Max's behavior around Sarah only intensified. Every single time she came over, he'd position himself directly between us on the couch. If we were watching a movie and I had my arm around her, Max would squeeze himself into that space, forcing me to choose between comforting my girlfriend or accommodating my dog. When she stayed the night, Max would pace the hallway outside my bedroom, whining and scratching at the door until I'd get up and check on him. My friends started joking about it constantly. "Max is jealous," they'd say. "He doesn't want to share his daddy with anyone." Even my veterinarian, Dr. Martinez, who'd known Max since he was a puppy, suggested that some dogs just take longer to accept new people in their owner's life, especially when that person represents a major change to their routine. But here's what really should have been a massive warning sign, something I'm almost embarrassed to admit I fell for. Sarah started positioning herself as the solution to Max's behavioral problem. She bought books about dog psychology, always leaving them strategically placed where I'd see them. Titles like Establishing Pack Hierarchy and Training Aggressive Dogs. She'd highlight passages about how dogs need to understand their place in the family structure, how allowing a dog to be territorial could lead to more serious behavioral issues down the line. She was so convincing, so logical and scientific about it all. "Jake," she'd say, using this patient, almost therapist-like tone, "Max is a wonderful dog, but he's clearly stressed by our relationship. For his own well-being, we need to establish boundaries. He needs to learn that you're the alpha, not him, and that I'm part of your pack now." She made it sound like she was looking out for Max's best interests, like she genuinely cared about his emotional health. I actually started to believe that maybe Max was the problem. Maybe I'd been too permissive with him over the years. Maybe Sarah's structured approach was exactly what we both needed. I began implementing her suggestions, making Max sleep in his own bed instead of mine when Sarah stayed over, not allowing him on the furniture when she was around, even changing his feeding schedule to establish clearer boundaries. Looking back now, I realized Sarah was systematically isolating me from my closest companion, and she was making me complicit in the process. She was so skilled at it that I never felt manipulated. Instead, I felt like we were working together as a team to solve a problem. The fact that the problem was my dog's accurate assessment of her character never occurred to me. Now, before I tell you about the wedding day disaster that changed everything, I need to share something that happened just 2 weeks before the ceremony. Something so bizarre and unsettling that it still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. Because what Max did that night was like he was desperately trying to show me physical evidence of what was coming. And I completely missed the message he was trying to send. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 14 days before our wedding. Sarah had been staying over more frequently as we prepared for the big day. And that particular evening, she'd gone to bed early, claiming she had a headache. I was staying up late in the living room, working on my vows and trying to get them perfect. I wanted to tell Sarah exactly how much she meant to me, how she'd changed my life, how I couldn't imagine a future without her. Max was lying on his bed in the corner, but I could tell he wasn't sleeping. His eyes were open, and he kept lifting his head to look toward the bedroom where Sarah was sleeping. Around midnight, he got up and started pacing. Not his usual restless energy, but something more purposeful, more urgent. Then he did something he'd never done before in 8 years. He went to Sarah's purse, which she'd left on the kitchen counter, and started pawing at it. Not aggressively, but persistently, like he was trying to get my attention. Max had been trained since puppyhood never to touch other people's belongings. It was one of his most reliable behaviors. But here he was, completely ignoring his training. I whispered harshly at him to stop, worried he'd wake Sarah up. But every time I turned back to my laptop, he'd start again. Finally, I got up to physically move him away from the counter, and that's when I noticed something odd. Sarah's purse wasn't fully closed, and there was a faint blue light coming from inside it. I thought maybe her phone was getting notifications, but that didn't make sense. Sarah always put her phone on silent at night, and besides, I could see her regular iPhone charging on the nightstand in the bedroom. Curiosity got the better of me. I carefully opened the purse a little wider, and what I saw confused me completely. There was a second phone in there, an older model flip phone that looked like it hadn't been manufactured in years. It was the source of the blue light, indicating it had received a message. Why would Sarah have 2 phones? And why would she keep this one hidden while charging her regular phone so obviously in the bedroom? Max sat down right in front of me and gave me the most intense stare I'd ever seen from him. It was like he was saying, "Finally, you're paying attention to what I've been trying to tell you." But I was so conditioned to dismiss his instincts about Sarah that I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an old work phone she'd forgotten to turn in. Maybe it belonged to a friend who'd asked her to hold on to it. Maybe it was a backup phone in case her main one broke. I closed the purse without looking at the message, went back to working on my vows, and never mentioned the incident to Sarah. I told myself I was respecting her privacy, but really, I think I was afraid of what I might discover if I asked too many questions. That night should have been my wake-up call, but I was so deep in wedding planning mode, so committed to the idea that I was about to marry my soulmate, that I pushed the whole thing out of my mind. I had no idea that Max's strange behavior that night was just a preview of what was coming. Because on our wedding day, Max would make one final, desperate attempt to save me from the biggest mistake of my life. And this time, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Our wedding day dawned absolutely perfect. Clear blue sky, gentle breeze, temperature in the mid-70s. Everything we'd hoped for when we'd booked the outdoor venue 6 months earlier. The location was a beautiful garden estate about an hour outside the city, with rolling hills, ancient oak trees, and a stone gazebo where we'd exchange vows. Sarah had insisted on this venue, saying she'd dreamed of a fairy tale wedding since she was a little girl. The morning started normally enough, though I noticed Max seemed more agitated than usual. He wouldn't eat his breakfast, kept pacing between rooms, and every time someone mentioned Sarah's name, which was constantly, since it was our wedding day, his ears would perk up and he'd start that low rumbling growl that had become so familiar over the past months. My best man, Derek, was supposed to be in charge of Max during the ceremony. The plan was to keep Max on a leash near the back of the seating area, where he could see me but wouldn't interfere with the proceedings. Even your dog knows you're making a mistake, Derek joked as he clipped the leash to Max's collar. Look at him. He looks like he's preparing for battle. We all laughed, but Derek's words turned out to be more prophetic than any of us realized. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. By 3:30, all the guests had arrived and taken their seats. I was standing at the altar with the officiant, trying to calm my nerves and focus on the moment I'd been anticipating for months. The string quartet started playing, and everyone turned to watch for Sarah's entrance. Then I heard it, that unmistakable sound that had become the soundtrack of my relationship with Sarah. Max's growl, but amplified and more intense than I'd ever heard it before. I looked toward the back of the ceremony area and saw Derek struggling with Max's leash. Somehow, Max had gotten loose and was standing in the center aisle, every muscle in his body tense, staring directly at the entrance where Sarah would appear. The growling got louder, more urgent. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was almost like Max was trying to communicate something specific, something desperate. The wedding guests started murmuring, turning in their seats to see what was causing the disturbance. I felt my face burning with embarrassment. This was supposed to be the most perfect day of my life, and my dog was ruining it. Then the music changed to the bridal march, and Sarah appeared at the entrance to the aisle. She looked absolutely breathtaking. Her dress was a flowing white gown that seemed to float as she moved. Her hair was perfectly styled with small white flowers woven through it, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like something out of a fairy tale, exactly as she'd always dreamed. But the moment Sarah started walking down the aisle, Max's behavior escalated to something I'd never witnessed before. He wasn't just growling anymore. He was barking, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed off the stone gazebo and made several guests jump in their seats. He was straining against Derek so hard that I was afraid he might actually break free and run toward Sarah. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. Sarah stopped walking. Not because she was startled by Max's barking. That would have been a normal reaction. She stopped and stared directly at Max with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't fear, surprise, or even annoyance. It was recognition. Like she knew exactly why Max was reacting this way, like she'd been expecting it. For just a split second, maybe 3 or 4 heartbeats, Sarah and Max stared at each other across that wedding aisle, and I swear I could feel some kind of communication passing between them. Then Sarah's expression changed back to her normal, sweet smile, and she continued walking toward me as if nothing had happened. Derek managed to get control of Max and quickly led him away from the ceremony area, apologizing profusely to the guests as they passed. Sarah reached the altar, took my hands in hers, and made a joke about how Max was just making sure she was good enough for me. Everyone laughed, the tension broke, and we continued with the ceremony. But I couldn't shake the image of that moment when Sarah and Max had locked eyes. There had been something there, some understanding that excluded me completely. It was like watching 2 people who shared a secret, except one of them was my dog, and the other was the woman I was about to promise to love for the rest of my life. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. We exchanged vows, rings, and our first kiss as husband and wife. The guests cheered, the photographer captured every moment, and everything proceeded exactly as we'd planned. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about Max's desperate barking and Sarah's strange reaction to it. During the reception, we decided to bring Max back out, thinking that maybe he'd calm down now that the ceremony was over. We were wrong. Every time Sarah approached the head table where Max was supposed to be resting, he'd start up again, not as intensely as during the ceremony, but enough that it was becoming disruptive to our guests. Finally, my brother suggested we keep Max inside the house for the rest of the evening. He's probably just overwhelmed by all the people and activity, he said, which seemed reasonable. Max had never been around this many strangers at once, and it was possible that the stress of the day was affecting his behavior. But as my brother led Max toward the house, I watched my dog turn back to look at me one more time. The expression in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. It was almost like disappointment, like he was giving up on trying to protect me because I'd refused to listen to his warnings. I spent our wedding night and the entire honeymoon convinced that once we got back home, I'd work with a professional animal behaviorist to help Max adjust to Sarah being part of our family permanently. I'd already researched trainers and planned to call them as soon as we returned. I had no idea that in just 3 days, Max would reveal a truth so horrifying and devastating that it would make me question everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the woman who was now legally my wife. Our honeymoon was a week in Maui, something Sarah had insisted on, saying she'd always dreamed of watching the sunrise from Haleakala Crater. It was expensive, more than I'd originally budgeted for the wedding, but Sarah had a way of making her dreams sound so romantic and important that I found myself saying yes to things I might normally have questioned. The trip itself was beautiful, but I found myself thinking about Max more than I expected. I'd arranged for my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, to check on him daily, but I kept wondering how he was handling our absence. Was he still agitated? Was he eating properly? I even called Mrs. Chun twice to check on him, which Sarah found amusing. "You're such a devoted dog dad," she said, curling up next to me on the beach. "It's one of the things I love about you, how much you care about the people and animals in your life." At the time, I thought it was sweet that she understood my bond with Max. Now I realized she was probably calculating how to use that bond against me. During the honeymoon, Sarah seemed different somehow, more relaxed, more confident. She'd always been poised and self-assured, but now there was something almost triumphant about her demeanor. She kept talking about our future, making plans for redecorating the house, discussing which of my friends she thought we should spend more time with, and which ones might be holding me back from my potential. She also brought up Max several times, always in the context of training and behavioral modification. "I've been thinking about what happened at the wedding," she'd say. "I really think we need to take a firm approach with Max when we get back. Maybe it's time to consider boarding him with a professional trainer for a few weeks, just to reset his behavior patterns." The idea made me uncomfortable, but Sarah had a way of presenting her suggestions as logical, carrying solutions to problems I hadn't even realized we had. "I know it's hard to think about being separated from him," she'd continue, "but it's really for his own good. He's clearly stressed by the changes in his routine, and professional training could help him adjust to our new family dynamic." We got back from our honeymoon on a Tuesday afternoon. I was exhausted from the travel, but excited to see Max again. The moment we walked through the front door, I called for him, expecting his usual enthusiastic greeting. The spinning in circles, the happy barking, the full-body wiggles that always made me laugh. Instead, Max appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room and just stood there, staring at us. Not at me, at us as a unit. His tail wasn't wagging, his ears were alert, and his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. It was like he was assessing a situation, trying to determine the level of threat we represented. "Hey, buddy," I said, dropping to one knee and patting my legs to encourage him to come over. "Did you miss me?" "I missed you too." Max looked at me for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Sarah, who was standing slightly behind me with our luggage. That's when his demeanor changed completely. The moment his eyes focused on Sarah, every muscle in his body went tense. His ears went back, his hackles raised, and that familiar low growl started rumbling in his chest. But this time, it felt different, more determined, more urgent, like he'd spent our entire week away preparing for this moment. Sarah sighed dramatically. "Well, I guess our honeymoon period is officially over," she said with a laugh that sounded forced. "Jake, we really need to address this behavior. It's not fair to any of us to live like this." I spent the next few hours unpacking and trying to get Max to relax around Sarah, but nothing worked. If anything, his behavior seemed more intense than before we'd left. He wouldn't leave my side, constantly positioning himself between Sarah and me, and every time she moved toward us, he'd start that warning growl again. That evening, Sarah announced she had some errands to run and would be back later for dinner. "I need to pick up a few things for the house," she said, grabbing her purse from the kitchen counter. "And maybe I'll stop by that pet store we passed on the way home, see if they have any recommendations for dog trainers." The moment Sarah's car pulled out of our driveway, Max's entire demeanor transformed. The tension left his body, his tail started wagging, and he came over to me for the enthusiastic greeting I'd been expecting earlier. It was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly, he was my happy, loving dog again, acting completely normal for the first time since we'd returned home. But then he did something that caught my attention. He walked over to the kitchen counter where Sarah had grabbed her purse and started pawing at the spot where it had been sitting. He kept looking back at me, then back at the counter, like he was trying to tell me something important about that specific location. At first, I thought Max was just sniffing around because Sarah's scent was stronger there, but his behavior was too purposeful, too insistent. He kept pawing at the counter and looking at me with that same intense stare I'd seen 2 weeks before the wedding, the night he'd been so interested in Sarah's purse. That's when I remembered the second phone I'd glimpsed that night, the old flip phone that had been glowing with a message. I'd pushed the memory out of my mind during all the wedding preparations and honeymoon planning, but now it came flooding back. Max had been trying to show me something that night, and I'd ignored him. I looked around the kitchen, wondering if Sarah had left anything behind in her rush to run errands. That's when I noticed her purse sitting on the floor next to the kitchen island. Not the purse she'd taken with her, but a different one, a smaller clutch that she sometimes used for quick trips. Max immediately went to the clutch and sat down next to it, giving me that same meaningful stare. His message was clear. "Look in here. This is what I've been trying to show you." I knew I shouldn't invade Sarah's privacy, but something about Max's behavior made me feel like this was important, like he was trying to protect me from something. With trembling hands, I opened the clutch. Inside was the same old flip phone I'd seen weeks earlier, along with something else that made my heart skip a beat, a small notebook with handwritten notes. The phone was off, but the notebook was open to a page filled with what looked like observations about my daily routine. Jake leaves for work at 8:15 a.m. Returns home between 6:30 to 7 p.m. Goes to gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Walks Max every morning at 6:45 a.m. My hands were shaking as I flipped through more pages. There were notes about my friends, my family, my business, even my financial habits. Jake's business account at First National Bank. Estimated monthly income, $8,500. Life insurance policy through work, $500,000 benefit. No significant debt except mortgage. This wasn't the kind of information a loving girlfriend would casually collect about her boyfriend. This was reconnaissance. This was someone studying me like I was a target. But I still couldn't bring myself to turn on that phone. Some part of me was still hoping there was an innocent explanation, that I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. Maybe Sarah was planning a surprise for me, or maybe these notes were for some other purpose I couldn't imagine. Max seemed to sense my hesitation. He walked over to where I was sitting at the kitchen table and dropped his favorite toy, an old tennis ball he'd had since he was a puppy, right on top of the notebook. Then he looked up at me with eyes that seemed to say, "Please, for once in your life, listen to what I'm trying to tell you." That's when I finally turned on the phone. The first thing I saw was a text message, thread with someone named David. The messages were recent, some from just that morning, while Sarah and I were unpacking from our honeymoon. My heart pounded as I read through them. How did the wedding go? Did the dog cause problems? Max was a nightmare, but I handled it. Jake is completely clueless. Good. How much longer do you think you need? Give me 6 months to get full access to his accounts, then we can move to phase 2. What about the dog? He's obviously suspicious. I'm working on convincing Jake to send him away for training. Once Max is gone, this will be much easier. I felt like I was going to be sick. My wife of 3 days was texting with someone about getting access to my accounts and removing Max from the picture. But there were dozens more messages going back months. I kept scrolling, reading conversation after conversation about their plans, their relationship, and how I fit into their scheme. The messages revealed that Sarah and David had been together for over 2 years. They had a system. Sarah would target financially stable men, build relationships with them, and then systematically gain access to their assets. I wasn't her first victim. There were references to the last guy in Phoenix and that businessman in Seattle, and how they'd learned from those experiences to be more careful this time. But the most chilling part was how they talked about Max. David kept asking about the dog problem, and Sarah kept reassuring him that she was handling it. There were messages about different strategies they'd considered, from having Max accidentally get loose and disappear, to convincing me that he'd become dangerous and needed to be put down. The dog knows. Sarah had texted just 2 days before our wedding. Animals can sense things. But Jake loves me too much to listen to a dog over his fiancée. Just get through the wedding, David had replied. Once you're legally married, we'll have more options. I sat there staring at that phone for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Max never left my side, occasionally nuzzling my hand as if to offer comfort. Everything made sense now. Max's immediate distrust of Sarah, his increasingly desperate attempts to warn me, his behavior at the wedding. He'd been trying to save me from the beginning, and I'd been too blinded by what I thought was love to listen to him. I was still sitting at the kitchen table with the phone in my hands when I heard Sarah's car pull into the driveway. Max immediately went into alert mode. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and he positioned himself between me and the front door. But this time, I understood what he was doing. He wasn't being territorial or jealous. He was protecting me from a threat. I quickly put the phone and notebook back in the clutch, but kept them on the table in front of me. I needed to confront Sarah with what I'd found, but I also needed to be smart about it. These messages suggested that she and David were capable of much more than just financial fraud. Sarah walked through the front door with shopping bags, calling out cheerfully, "Honey, I'm home. I got some great stuff for the house. And I think I found the perfect trainer for Max." She sounded so normal, so loving, that for a moment I wondered if I'd somehow misunderstood what I'd read. But then she walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting at the table with her clutch open in front of me. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The warm, loving expression on her face disappeared completely, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. "You went through my personal belongings," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and there was no hint of the hurt or betrayal you'd expect from someone whose privacy had been violated. Instead, she sounded annoyed, like I'd disrupted a carefully planned schedule. "Sarah," I started, but she cut me off. "How much did you read?" She was looking directly at the phone in my hands, and I realized she wasn't even going to try to deny what I'd found. "Enough," I said, my voice shaking. "Enough to know that everything about our relationship has been a lie. Enough to know that you and David have been planning this for months. Enough to know that you've done this before." Sarah walked over to the kitchen island and leaned against it, studying me like I was a problem she needed to solve. "You know, Jake, I actually started to like you a little bit over these past few months. You're sweet and generous, and you genuinely care about people. In another life, we might have actually worked out." The casual way she said it, like our entire relationship had been nothing more than a business transaction, was almost worse than discovering the deception in the first place. But your dog, she continued, glancing down at Max, who was still stationed protectively beside my chair. Your dog was always going to be a problem. Animals can sense things that people miss, and Max knew from the very beginning that I wasn't who I claimed to be. I tried to convince you to get rid of him, but you were too attached. Max was trying to protect me, I said, reaching down to put my hand on his head. He knew you were dangerous. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Dangerous? Jake, I'm not dangerous. I'm practical. You have money, resources, and a life insurance policy. David and I have expenses. It's really that simple. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Sarah didn't seem angry or upset about being caught. She seemed irritated that her plan had been disrupted. She talked about our relationship like it was a business deal that had gone wrong, explaining how they'd researched me for weeks before she'd accidentally bumped into me at the coffee shop where we'd first met. She told me about the other men she'd targeted, how some had been easier to manipulate than others, and how Max had been the biggest obstacle she'd ever encountered in her work. Most people don't have pets that are that intuitive, she said. Usually, if there's a dog involved, I can win them over with treats and attention. But Max saw right through me from day one. Throughout this entire surreal conversation, Max never left my side. He sat perfectly still, alert and protective, like he understood that his job wasn't finished yet. Occasionally, Sarah would look at him with an expression that was almost like respect. I have to admit, she said at one point, he's a remarkable animal. If I were actually the person I pretended to be, I'd probably love him too. The most chilling moment came when Sarah started talking about what would have happened if I hadn't discovered the phone. She described a 6-month timeline during which she would have gradually gained access to my bank accounts, business information, and personal documents. The goal was never to take everything at once, she explained. That's too obvious, too traceable. The idea was to slowly transfer assets, create joint accounts, maybe even convince you to make some risky business investments that would fail. By the time you realized what was happening, David and I would have been long gone with enough money to start over somewhere else. And Max? I asked, dreading the answer. Max would have had an accident, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Nothing violent or suspicious. Maybe he would have gotten loose and been hit by a car or eaten something poisonous during one of your walks. Dogs are curious creatures. Accidents happen all the time. The conversation ended when I told Sarah I was calling the police. She didn't seem surprised or particularly concerned. You can try, she said, but what exactly are you going to tell them? That your wife has a second phone and takes notes about your schedule? That she's been texting with another man? None of that is actually illegal, Jake. She was right to a point. What I'd discovered was evidence of planning and intent, but Sarah and David hadn't actually stolen anything yet. They'd been careful to stay just on the legal side of the line while they set up their scheme. But Sarah had underestimated how thoroughly she and David had documented their activities. The phone contained not just their messages about me, but evidence of their previous victims as well. Names, account numbers, photographs of documents, even recordings of conversations. They'd kept everything, probably as insurance against each other. When the police arrived, they were very interested in that phone and its contents. It turned out that Sarah Mitchell wasn't even her real name. She was actually Jennifer Walsh, and she and David Chun had been running similar schemes across multiple states for over 3 years. The FBI had been looking for them in connection with fraud cases in Arizona, Washington, and Nevada. The marriage was annulled within 2 weeks. It turned out that Sarah's previous marriage, to a man in Phoenix who'd lost his life savings to her scheme, had never been legally dissolved, which meant our marriage was invalid from the beginning. In a strange way, that was almost a relief. It meant I'd never actually been married to the woman who'd tried to destroy my life. Sarah and David were both arrested and eventually convicted on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Sarah received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison. David got 6 years. The other victims were finally able to get some closure, though most of them never recovered the money they'd lost. As for me, I learned some hard lessons about trust, intuition, and the importance of listening to those who truly care about us. Max had been trying to save me from the very beginning, using every tool available to him, his instincts, his behavior, even his desperate attempts to show me evidence of Sarah's deception. The most remarkable thing is that throughout this entire ordeal, Max never wavered in his protection of me. Even during the months when I was dismissing his warnings and implementing Sarah's suggestions for training him, he never stopped trying to keep me safe. His loyalty was absolute, even when mine was misplaced. I've learned to trust Max's judgment completely now. When I eventually started dating again, about a year later, Max's reaction to new people became my first and most important screening process. If Max doesn't like someone, I pay attention. His track record is perfect. He's never been wrong about a person's character, while I've been spectacularly wrong at least once. Max is lying next to me as I record this story, and I swear he looks proud of himself. He should be. He saved me from what could have been years of manipulation, financial ruin, and possibly even physical danger. The messages on that phone suggested that Sarah and David's plans for me went far beyond just stealing money. My life insurance policy had been a major factor in their calculations, and I don't like to think about what that might have meant for my long-term survival. I've also learned to appreciate the incredible bond between humans and animals and the ways that pets try to communicate with us. Dogs, in particular, have senses and instincts that far exceed our own. They can detect changes in scent, body language, and behavior that we miss completely. Max knew Sarah was dangerous months before I was willing to admit there was even a problem. The experience has made me a better judge of character in general. I pay more attention to inconsistencies in people's stories, to the difference between what someone says and what they do, and to my own gut instincts about new people in my life. I've learned that love, real love, doesn't require you to ignore red flags or dismiss the concerns of those who care about you. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Pay attention to your pet's instincts about new people in your life. Don't dismiss their behavior as jealousy or territorial aggression. Animals, especially dogs, can sense things about people that we miss completely. They're not influenced by physical attraction, charm, or manipulation. They respond to what someone actually is, not what they pretend to be. Max saved my life, my financial future, and possibly even prevented me from becoming another unsolved missing person case. He's the best judge of character I've ever known, and the most loyal friend I could ask for. Tonight, he's getting a steak dinner and all the belly rubs he wants. He's more than earned it. Trust your instincts, trust your pet's instincts, and remember that sometimes the most important warnings come from those who love you unconditionally. Max couldn't speak my language, but he never stopped trying to tell me the truth. I just wish I'd listened to him sooner. And Sarah, if you're somehow watching this from prison, Max says hello, and he's never been happier to be right about someone. Good dogs always know.